Edmund Burke's philosophy is most notably known as conservatism. He is widely considered the founder of the modern conservative political tradition. His philosophy emphasizes the importance of tradition, social institutions, and gradual evolutionary change over radical or revolutionary upheaval. Let's just clear some myths first. Conservatism does not believe you're completely against change. It simply means that you're skeptical of radical change. It believes in an organic view of society, which means that the society is an organic entity that evolves naturally over time. If you attempt to radically reshape that society, it would lead to unintended consequences and social disorder, as evidenced in the French Revolution. Now that we have that cleared up, let's dive into Burke's philosophy and try to understand what exactly he was trying to say. Burke believed that using compound abstract words is not just an intellectual exercise. He believed that political language should connect with how people actually feel and live. It should not remain theoretical. Because of this, his idea of persuasion becomes central to politics. Politics is described by him as a practical subject. It's not a speculative one. That means that the goal of political discussion is not to think for thinking's sake, but to influence action. Talking about politics should lead people to do something, not just understand something. Since political language is inherently persuasive, its purpose is to shape attitudes in people's minds. Specifically, it aims to create pro-attitudes, that is, favorable views, and con-attitudes, that is, unfavorable views, in the listener or the reader. Let's talk about the second most important philosophical idea that Edmund Burke had pushed forward. It is called relation. This concept was shared by both the scholastics and Locke, showing that Burke was drawing from older philosophical traditions as well as modern ones. Relation has two main meanings: comparison and connection. Comparison is valuable because it allows people, events, or institutions to be seen from different angles. By comparing things, a speaker can raise or lower their importance or change how significantly they appear. This is especially useful in politics, where reputation and public perception matter. Next is connection. It's equally important. It focuses on the position of a person or an institution that they occupy within a larger system. By showing how something is connected to others, one can either defend or criticize its role. Connection also helps explain the idea of cooperative contraries, meaning opposing forces that still work together within a political structure. The strength of relation in both senses is its flexibility. It can be used in countless ways, making relation an extremely powerful political and rhetorical tool. Let us now look at some historical insights that were given by Burke. Burke believed that each individual age has its own manners, social habits, values, customs, and politics depends on those manners. Politics does not float above society, it grows out of how people live and think at a particular time. When Burke looked at England that he lived in, he believed its political manners showed continuity with the Middle Ages. He imagined a system where a strong executive government existed but was balanced by other institutions. This balance, rather than unchecked power, was what ensured civil liberty. So Burke did not see English liberty as a sudden modern invention, but as something historically shaped and preserved through restraint and balance. By Burke's time, this public was mainly expressed through Parliament, though the monarch still exercised strong influence. Given this historical situation, Burke's political work naturally rested on the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament, rather than the king alone, or the people acting directly, became the legitimate center of political authority. So if you look at whatever we have discussed so far, a question arises. If Burke's ideas about language and relation gave him tools for political action, and if parliamentary sovereignty was his starting assumption, then what did he believe sovereignty was actually for? He answers that it exists mainly to protect civil interests, things like property, security, stability, and everyday freedoms. However, problems arise once you recognize the multiplicity of civil interests. Society is not made up of one interest, but many, often conflicting ones. There are also many relations and contraries at work. Because of this, achieving social harmony often involves conflict, and such conflict is almost unavoidable. Burke understood that Parliament exists precisely to manage this conflict. It acts as an arena where opposing interests are expressed in a stylized and moderated form through representation. This is what makes it suitable for a civilized society. Crucially, Burke recognized that political opponents are not always simple enemies. They can also be co-workers, necessary to the functioning of the system. Even when they oppose each other, they often share common assumptions about the political framework itself. Their differences arise from the roles they are required to play. So in this situation, politics becomes a question of position. Where do you stand? Burke's answer is not abstract or universal. It depends on one's connections, social, historical, institutional, and on how one understands these connections. Political judgment, therefore, is contextual, relational, and rooted in lived structures rather than pure theory. Let's try and understand this through an example. Imagine a debate in the parliament about raising taxes to fund poor relief. A purely abstract thinker might say higher taxes are just, because equality and welfare are universal goods. From that angle, the answer is fixed in advance, and it should apply everywhere to everyone regardless of their circumstances. Burke would approach this very differently. For him, the question is, first, where do you stand? Are you a landowner? Are you a merchant? Or a representative of an industrial town or an agricultural county? What institutions do you belong to? What historical arrangements already exist between taxpayers, the poor, the church, and the local authorities? These would be your connections. Now, suppose you represent a rural county where landowners already support the poor through parish relief and customary obligations. From that position, a sudden central tax imposed by Parliament might weaken local responsibility and damage long-standing social bonds. You might therefore oppose the reform not because you oppose helping the poor, but because, given your connections, the proposal disrupts a working moral economy. Now imagine another MP who is representing a growing industrial city where traditional parish systems have collapsed. There, poverty is widespread and impersonal, and local customs no longer function. From that position, supporting parliamentary intervention makes sense, because your connections show that older arrangements no longer protect civil interests. So in Burke's views, both positions can be legitimate. The disagreement is not between good and evil, but between different social locations within the same political system. This is why opponents in Parliament can be co-workers rather than enemies. They share a commitment to the system, even while arguing fiercely within it. So the key Burkean point is this. Political judgment is not about applying a universal rule, but about reading your place in a web of relations and acting responsibly within it. Where you stand shapes what you ought to support. To understand how this philosophy came to be, we need to understand Burke's view of human nature. The core idea is that Burke did not see nature as either perfect or evil. He believed that human nature needs improvement, but he also understood that it is ambiguous, meaning that the same human traits can produce both good and harm. Improvement for Burke is never simple or guaranteed. Take ambition, for example. Burke recognized ambition as a major source of enterprise and progress. Without ambitions, societies would stagnate. However, he strongly rejected the idea that ambition is always beneficial. He warned that ambition often leads to disappointment, misery, misfortune, and even moral danger. So while ambition drives development, it can also damage individuals and societies. Burke therefore refuses a naive celebration of human drives. And this shows that although Burke had a forward-looking mind and believed that human nature both requires development and naturally tends towards it, he did not equate development with automatic improvement. Progress, in his view, is not an unqualified gain. Every gain may involve a loss somewhere else, and every refinement may weaken something valuable. This becomes clear in his discussion of the so-called civilizing of American savages. Burke observed that as indigenous societies become more civilized, they gain moral refinement, but they also lost courage. Civilization improved certain virtues while diminishing others. This is a crucial Burkean insight. Improvement reshapes character, and not always in ways that are wholly positive. So you can see that for Burke, savagery contrasts with civilization, but he did not believe that indigenous people were morally inferior or that all their behavior was savage. Unlike some thinkers of his time, he did not collapse indigenous life into barbarism. His concern was with the effects of civilization, not with denying the humanity or value of non-European cultures. Now that we have discussed Burke's idea of the human nature, let's move on to the psychological foundation of this human nature, which Burke believed that all human activity begins in passions, not in pure reason. The most basic passions are curiosity, pleasure, and pain. Curiosity drives mental activity. It makes people think, inquire, and engage with the world. Pain is linked to self-preservation, the instinct to survive and avoid harm. Pleasure is linked to society, because social life is where humans find enjoyment, attachment, and fulfillment. Within society, there are three important passions that Burke identified: sympathy, imitation, and ambition. Imitation creates habit. People copy others, which stabilizes behavior and produces continuity. Ambition, as we have discussed earlier, creates change. It pushes people to improve their position and reshape society. Sympathy is a bit different. It neither stabilizes nor disrupts society, but it creates an interest in others' welfare. Sympathy allows people to mentally place themselves in another's position. This is unlike compassion, which applies only to those who are worse off than us. Sympathy can extend to anyone. This wide emotional reach supports social order because it binds people together emotionally. This also links to Burke's ideas about theater, where spectators identify with characters they're not personally like. So from this psychology, Burke concluded two things at once. First is that society is natural, it's not artificial. And second, that society contains both continuity through habit and imitation, and improvement through ambition. Burke would then connect these passions to his aesthetic theory. The instinct for self-preservation produces the idea of the sublime, which involves fear, awe, and power, and leads to the idea of a god who is active and terrifying. Beauty, on the other hand, comes from pleasure, and it produces a gentler, more attractive feeling. The sublime and the beautiful therefore arise from different emotional origins. But today we're not discussing Edmund Burke's aesthetic theory. We're talking about his political theories. And that's why we're talking about human nature, because at the end of the day, it's human nature which creates connections among them, including political connections. Burke rejected theories that assumed human nature in its raw unsocial state was sufficient or ideal. He opposed thinkers like Rousseau, who argued that society corrupts natural humans. Burke believed that solitude is unnatural and painful, and that society is natural, and that sympathy, not mere compassion, is the key human emotion. Over the course of this lecture, I have talked about human activity, human nature, and conservatism. But how do they all relate to each other? Burke's conservatism arises from his psychological view that human beings are passionate, socially embedded, and morally mixed. Since society grows naturally from sympathy, habit, and ambition, political change must respect continuity while cautiously managing improvement. So this was all about conservatism. If you'd like to know more about the opposing stream to conservatism, which is liberalism, you can have a look at this lecture on liberalism.